Welcome everybody to the first research seminar of the fall of 2024. I'm very happy to have Maja Fjaestad, our own researcher, Maja Fjaestad here, who's going to speak about post-pandemic reflection on leadership and preparedness, crisis management, and the concept of following science, something we heard a lot about. So as I said, Maja is a researcher here, but also at Luleå Technological University and an expert coordinator at the Center for Health Crisis at Karolinska. You have done your studies in technology studies and wrote a thesis that I can warmly recommend. It's very interesting. It's a vision of inexhaustible energy, the fast breeder reactor in Swedish nuclear power history. So it's basically focused on how prognosis and ideas about the future influence political decisions, something we are very interested in here, of course. And at that time, you had the supervisor Thomas Kaiserfeld, very good, and Thomas joined there. But now you've done research on the interaction between society, technology, and values in algorithmic decision-making, AI, and on crisis management. And the latter you're going to talk about today, and it's about this book that I also recommend. Mitt, krisen, in the middle of the crisis, or in the midst of the crisis. But you also written or edited another book, an anthology, AI and the Power of Decision, what everyone should know about algorithm in the public sector, which also came out this year, and we will have a seminar on that, I think, September 24th. So you're all welcome to that too. But with that said, I'll leave the floor to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I think my CV sounded much more coherent when you presented it than when I look at it. Thank you so much for having me and having the opportunity to speak about pandemics and a little bit of expertise. So I have a bit of a scattered background, as Gustav indicated, but not what you didn't fully say it. But sometime in the beginning of time, I was a physicist, and then I got caught up in history of technology, or STS, Science and Technology Studies, as we say. And then I was pulled away from research to be state secretary for 2 mandate periods, first in the Prime Minister's office, and then I was state secretary at the Minister for Health during 5 years. And since we lost the election, I have been moving a little bit back to research. So bad for the country, good for academia, as I say. But right now I'm on many places. I am at the Karolinska Institute, where I am employed part-time and at the Center for Health Crisis. Most importantly, I am at the Institute for Future Studies, and I think I'm eternally affiliated here, partly because you never added your website, but that's okay, because I'm very honored and very glad to be affiliated here, and I actually do have my algorithm project here.
We thought in the future you would be.
That's very good. So I will speak about that project that is formally part of the Institute for Future Studies in the end of September. I'm also employed 20% at Umeå University at the AI Policy Lab. I am at 5% in Luleå, and I'm also in the board of Göteborg University. But I don't live in any of these places. I live in Brussels. And in Brussels, I'm at the European Policy Center, which is an academic think tank. So out of this mess, I'm going to do some sort of coherent presentation. So this will be a presentation that is sort of semi-academic. I will speak a little bit about my book, and I will speak a little bit about my emerging research. But please be warned that there will be academic parts of the talk, but it's mostly based on a book and on my experiences. And the idea of trying to put experiences into a academic understanding, which I think is both a privilege and a bit of a challenge as an academic in politics. And this is my PhD, my dissertation in picture. It's very pretty, apart from interesting. And this is the book I'm going to speak a little bit about. When our publishing company suggested the title In the Midst of the Crisis, Emma Lennartsson, who I wrote the book together with, she was state secretary for the Minister of Finance. We were very appalled and said, like, look, we were not in the midst of the crisis. You should speak to, the people in healthcare. This is a silly name. But then the publisher company's argument was that, look, but this was a crisis with many epicenters. And this is actually a point in pointing that out. And well, obviously they convinced us. So it's a little bit ironic saying we were in the midst of the crisis. In some parts we were, but on the other hand, everyone sort of had their own epicenter of the COVID pandemic. And I think that has also been an interesting part of publishing the book, that so many people retell their experiences from COVID. We have been experiencing that there's a need to speak of personal experiences from the COVID year. And I think that's interesting from sort of an anthropological point of view. So yes, this is me and Lena. I know that this picture is from March 2020 because, well, partly we're so pale and tired, and we're sitting with one chair in between, so we're trying to hold the distance. This was before people tried to walk from home a little bit, but we're trying to keep a distance. And I've learned after publishing the book that there's an entire genre of literature called hot seat literature. And hot seat literature, that's where mostly male, like American head of banking publishes a book about, oh, so I handled this financial crisis, and oh, everything went so well, and I never slept, and I drank a lot of whiskey. And then in the end, there's sort of the hero of the story. And this is not a hero story. We really wanted to write everything that was difficult, the things that didn't go so well, some sort of, speculations or possibly conclusions of why things didn't always go well, and also try to be honest about that, and try to be reflective. And I don't know why I put a picture of many happy people, because it was not a happy time. And I remember that I thought that during the COVID years, that I never want to become one of these people who say, oh, it was such a rewarding time. I learned so much, and it was so, I developed as a person and as a leader. But so nowadays I sometimes actually do find myself saying, oh, it was a bit rewarding. But I always thought that I will remember that it was horrible. But it was also politics, and also crisis management is also relational. And we wanted to describe that as well. I mean, the relationship between politicians, negotiations, the relationship to government agencies. It's not friendship, but it's at least it's a relation that has to do with individuals, and we wanted to express that, and that is actually not well described in crisis literature, I think. So we wanted to write a relational book, and so many silly pictures, sorry. Another backdrop of working with pandemic in Sweden was, of course, the international attention. I don't know if you remember this newspaper article. This was from the New Yorker. I think it was published in, April. No, this is from April 2021. And they described the Sweden's COVID strategy as light touch. And this was, of course, also part of our context, so to say. I mean, it wasn't like, oh, so people in the world think things, but we're just going to do our thing. No, of course, this was a part of dealing with the crisis as well, and also reflecting on how is it possible that experts in other countries come to so different conclusions than we do? How is it possible that countries come to different conclusions? And I would say that in the book, I argue two things that are possibly contradictory. And that is both that the Swedish response to the coronavirus wasn't that different. And sometimes I think it's overstated how different it was. The main difference was that we didn't close schools. For example, like a lockdown mostly doesn't imply that people don't go to their jobs. I mean, most people went to their jobs when they had to in all parts of Europe. And during some part of time, some gyms, for example, were closed in other countries and not in Sweden. But sometimes I think that the difference is overstated. There are a few specific treats of the Swedish legislation and constitution. One is that the agencies have a substantial degree of independence. They're not completely independent. Sometimes hear people say that in the debate. Of course, they're not. They are under the ministry and under the government, and the state secretary is the manager of the director general. So obviously we have some control of them. But you can't have ministerstyre. I couldn't find up a good English word. And that is a state secretary or a minister can never tell an agency how to handle a case of a singular citizen or a singular decision. And we also did not have a legislation for curfew in Sweden. And if we would have needed one, of course, we would have written one. It's laws can be written, but there was also no support in the parliament for having a legislation of curfew. And the Diseases Act, Smittskyddslagen, was actually a rather particular act. And I think that when we started the pandemic, I had like a lawyer on 25% working on this rather odd act. Nobody, never ever looked into it. And in the midst of the pandemic, like all our legal department worked at the Communicable Diseases Act. But it states specifically that measures against a contagious disease should be based on science and proven experience and must not be more far-reaching than is justifiable in the view of the danger to human health. And I don't think this was a very good legislation, to be honest. I put it together an inquiry to change it, and they're working, and I hope we will have a better act. I think that if we had had better legislation, we could have had more instruments. We did write a legislation to be able to have lockdown if we wanted to, and that rather messy political process is described in the book as well. Yeah, this is what happens if you do ministerstyre. You end up in the konstitutionsutskott, like I am on the picture. So don't do that. And I didn't. I was in the konstitutionsutskott for other reasons, just to be fully clear. So the Communicable Diseases Act really was the basis of the idea of listening to the experts in Sweden, I would say. And just to take a little bit, just to take like a quick view on Sweden's pandemic, the first month, or the play out of the pandemic in Sweden. I will not dwell too much on that because it's obviously well published. But I think this is one of the most interesting curves. This is the ICU during the pandemic, and the blue line here, this is COVID ICU. And you see that we had a very tough first wave of COVID. It's very steep, it's very high. And then the green line here is other ICU. People have normal diseases as well during COVID. And sort of the fantastic part of this curve is the turquoise line, and that is the number of free places in ICU. So this is, I think, sort of a diagram showing how fantastic Swedish healthcare were. When the skyrocketed the cases of COVID went into ICU, they kept increasing the capacity of ICU.
You can ask questions or clarifications. Questions and clarifications are okay. Long questions have to wait to like there's a lot of people are going to have that kind of. That's why we only take questions for during the presentation. Questions are controversial.
So this is also, I'm not going to go into detail on how Sweden did, because other people are much better than I to evaluate that. But I think an interesting part here is also to see, this shows, there's also a discussion on how to measure deaths, if you're dead with COVID or by COVID, or you can also measure surplus mortality. And the black part of the bar here is deaths with COVID during the first part of 2020. And the gray is deaths in the second half of 2020, and then 21. So we see that Sweden is here. During the first wave of COVID, we have very high deaths with COVID. We are in parity with Spain, United Kingdom, Italy, and Belgium. But then in the forthcoming waves, we're lower than other countries, and in the end, we're below the EU average. And also, if you look at the surplus mortality, we're somewhere here. So I think there's a lot of things to be criticized in the Swedish COVID management, but I wouldn't commit to a description that Sweden did horribly during COVID. Some things went better.
So that's a question, which window are you using here now? 3 years back, 5 years back? If you look at excessive mortality?
Yeah, that's a good, it's skattad normaldödlighet för samma period. And it is the procentuella skillnaden antal.
Okay, so that's a 3 year, it's just 2020.
Yeah.
Okay.
2020. And another aspect was that since we didn't really have a legislation to be able to do curfews or have a legislation to do other things, we worked a lot with recommendations, and that is also something that is partly particular to Sweden. And but actually it worked very well. People obliged to the recommendations surprisingly well, I would say. This is movement, travels per person. And if you look at how people limited their movement in Sweden compared to other countries, it was in parity with other countries, although it wasn't. For example, in South America, you ended up in jail or something if you took a walk. Obviously, you didn't do that in Sweden, but recommendations worked rather well. And one reason for that, I would say, is the high level of trust Swedes in general have for government agencies. This is the first line here is the Public Health Agency, and throughout the pandemic, they had a very high degree of trust. And that is, of course, also, I think, why it was possible to govern with recommendations instead of regulations. And that was also, therefore, it was also important to safeguard public trust, because if public trust were lost, I mean, due to, I don't know, in UK, there was a lot of scandals, I think, that harmed people's trust in the agencies or the government. But it was important to safeguard public trust in order to have a good adherence to recommendation. The question of face masks was a highly politicized one, and I think it's an interesting example of the relationship between science and politics. And I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't know whether face masks is a good idea from an epidemiological point of view or not. And my point is that it shouldn't be a political decision either. I wouldn't want a historian of science to decide which measures against contagion should be put in place. But I think it's interesting. Some countries, I think, used face masks as sort of as a measure that came in handy. And you remember that in the United States, this became a political conflict where the Democrats were sort of pro-face masks and the Republicans was against. And suddenly Sweden was on the side of Trump in some sort of COVID strategy. This was a highly politicized debate. And I write a little bit in the book that I thought it was, one argument would that, look, it wouldn't harm to have face masks. And during a period of time, we did recommend face masks. The Public Health Agency did recommend face masks. But I thought, that's an empirical question, isn't it? Whether people have longer distance to each other when wearing face masks because they have a visual reminder of a pandemic, or if they're closer to each other because they have some sort of false security that they are protected. And I was thinking that why aren't all the behavioral researchers in the world investigating this? This must be possible to study. And I think that was one of the parts when I think research could have helped when I felt that I at least didn't know. You do remember possibly that there was a rather vivid debate in Sweden, or actually there was this article written by 22 researchers who wanted to change the Swedish COVID policy. And they in their article, they suggested completely reasonable measures, mostly. And I think it was completely reasonable for researchers to write a debate article. I mean, it's important for researchers to take part in the public debates. But for some reasons, this article, when I speak to my colleagues at Karolinska Institute, they often describe it as the debate was so polarized that they referred from participating. And I think that we had too few researchers in Sweden actually participating in the public debates during COVID. And obviously, I don't know why, but I think that the highly politicization and the early sort of polarization of the debates, at least I know, referred some of my colleagues from participating. This has also been evaluated on many universities, how universities can do better and be more constructive partners to politics in the next crisis. This is a report from Karolinska Institute. They point at the cooperation and pre-existing relationships to policy, and also to some technicalities that I think also are very important, fast research permits and fast ethical approval, for example. I think it's a very interesting example of are we delegating responsibility, and this is also, of course, an academic discussion. So putting trust in experts, they may never be used as a way to avoid political responsibility. And of course, there's a risk that politicians want to hide behind experts because it's easier to let someone else take the blame. But the political task is, of course, to evaluate. I mean, does this measure have consequences that we want to have in a society? And on the other hand, there are decisions that we do delegate to expert bodies. One is pricing of medicines, for example, in Sweden, is handled by an expert body. Another is interest rates, handled by the central bank. And I thought it was funny because Bo Rothstein wrote yesterday, that to criticize the construction of the interest rate being decided by the central bank. So it's still, I mean, it can still be contested that these are delegated. But sometimes when you speak about blame game and delegating, it's interesting that there also is a democratic support to delegate some, to lifting discussions from the political sphere. This is Anders Tegnell, most often not wearing a flower laurel, and I describe in the book how it was a active political decision to let the public health agency to face much of the communication, and we felt rather generous when we gave this stage away to them. I mean, we wanted them to have the spotlight, also to have sort of a depoliticized communication. But on the other hand, it can also be argued that politicians try to hide between agencies or experts, and that is, of course, a discussion to be made, I think, in every crisis. So, having a background in research, I really wanted to have a relationship with academia, but I found that a little bit difficult, and I tried to describe that honestly in the book as well. That well, of course, we had an agency, and an agency part of a system of responsibility. I mean, if an agency is supposed to have sort of an eye on the research frontier, and then give advice to the government, and then if the agency gives horrible advice, then you can like sack the director general, or shut down the agency or something. If a group of researchers gives bad advice, then they can just say, oh, we got that wrong, better next time. But I really wanted to have a relationship to academia. And first I thought, okay, I'll just call Ole Petter, headmaster of Karolinska. And then I thought, okay, but then Umeå's headmaster will be angry. And then I organized a series of seminars with mainly virologists, etc. And then the paper wrote that we had unknown meetings in secret. And I think that this, I wanted to describe this in the book to illustrate how difficult it can be to form sort of a good science to policy system in the midst of a crisis. I mean, this is something that has to be constructed before a crisis. So now you're thinking she's doing a lot of screenshots on academic article, and I will do a lot of these slides, and I know it's a silly way of presenting, but it's always nice to have something to look at. And of course, there's a description of this. I mean, the difficulties I'm describing in the book, it was also difficult to be a science advisor during COVID. I think this is one of many interesting articles that describe difficulties to handle with limited capacity to assess, difficulties to reach out to policymakers, and difficulties of having to provide recommendations. And this article also describes a little bit how science advisors and researchers themselves struggled a little bit with the notion that scientists around the world interpreted data differently, and then politicians in different countries also reacted differently to science advice. And I was just thinking we should always remember Peter Gallison for many reasons, but obviously there's a social component to science. Science is constructed in a social environment, and I think some of these descriptions remind us of that. Oh, sorry. So science can also be an identifier of crisis, and I think this is also an interesting notion, the concept of the creeping crisis. And I think that there's a risk, and Sverker writes that in his book as well, that politicians tend to over-identify crisis. And sometimes as a politician, you'd want to describe something as a crisis, because the crisis concept gives you resources, it gives you money, it gives you more lawyers to your legal department, it gives you a lot of things you want to have. But you don't want to cry wolf, right? And if you cry wolf too many times, you lose the legitimacy for action that you would need in a real crisis. So the risk is to over-identify as a crisis, but there's also a risk. I mean, everything that people are worried about is not dangerous. I mean, people are worried about killer clowns or a lot of things that are not dangerous. So worry in itself does not imply a crisis. And that is also a part of, I think, where research or science is an important part of identifying when something is a crisis. And of course, we have the eternal example of the climate crisis that is well identified by all researchers, but there really lack of political actions, and where we definitely can speak of a science to policy gap or a science to action gap, because it's such a creeping crisis that it's convenient not to act on it. I think that the concept of preparedness, of course, is also interesting, and preparedness is always a balance between cost and risk. I mean, you want to be insured against everything. You want to have stockpiling or everything you might possibly need, but the costs for that would be so large so that they are impossible to handle. And there are other things that are costly in a society that is also part of civil defense. For example, social insurances or public health or well-functioning healthcare. That is also part of civil defense. And the exact balance between cost and risk must be a discussion, I think, in a democracy, because it's finding the right balance there is definitely a democratic issue. Wanted to highlight this very interesting article written by talented researchers, but it's interesting how worst case scenarios came into the discussion, and I think well put in this article that epidemiology cannot be expected to provide answers how uncertainty can be handled in a political situation. And one well-known example was, this is a messy slide, but I don't know if you remember that there was a controversy in UK. Neil Ferguson at Imperial College, he published a very dramatical forecast with 60% of the British population having COVID and hundreds of thousands deaths. And this forecast made the UK government change their policies and go into more lockdown. But then there was some scandal about Neil Ferguson. I don't even remember, but I think it had something to do with a lover or something. And then there was another model presented by Sunita Gupta at Oxford, who turned out in the end to be more accurate. But these kind of controversies around models, I think, is an interesting example. I think in every crisis we handle, there will be different models. And of course, models are highly, tends to steer political thinking in a very in a way that sometimes tends to be undemocratic, and I do elaborate on that in my dissertation, where I write about prognosis of uranium prices, and in my dissertation I write about how everyone thought that uranium prices would go up and up and up and up and up, and obviously they didn't. For a number of reasons, we found more uranium in Namibia. The world didn't build nuclear power in the way expected. Another very influential prognosis is the one of energy use. I think you've seen these kind of curves often. Sometimes you call it the hedgehog curve, because everyone tends to overestimate energy consumption. And of course, we do, build new industries and drive electrical cars, but in a historical perspective, energy efficient technology has tended to keep the energy consumption rather flat. Oh, sorry. And there is, of course, the literature also on how researchers can handle the uncertainties and can handle how to have a dialogue with politics. I think this is a very interesting handbook that was published in the summer from the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters, and they pointed to 3 roles that a researcher can have in science advice. Synthesizer, to put together research. This is a very classic role in research, but actually it's not we don't do it very often, to be honest, but there's an idea that we write policy briefs or synthesizing evidence to present to policymakers. A commentator, both on politics and on science, actually, and that is also of course, an important part of science communication, but also advocates. And I think that part is very interesting. How much of advocates can researchers be? Of course, a large discussion, but sometimes I think we're a little bit too scared to be advocates as researchers, because that is a part of a democracy, that researchers take part in the political debate. And this one is a similar handbook from the Austrian Academy of Science. Well, there are many interesting research groups doing this, and many of you are more into this than I am, but this is a research center that I think is very interesting. It's in Cambridge, and they also point out that it can be perfectly reasonable for well-informed citizens to defer to experts on relevant science, but also to disagree with the policy recommendations based on that science. And there are many examples of this, actually. One is, what's it called? The tax on buildings, help me. Fastighetsskatt. Property tax, thank you. If you ask any researcher in economics, they would say that property tax is the best tax ever. Well, that might be true, but if there's no democratic support for property tax. Another example that I often mention is Sweden, sorry, yes, it's Sweden. Another example that I often use is smaller classes in schools. If you ask the general public what they want from school policy, they say, we want smaller classes for our children. But if you want to ask a school researcher, if we would invest more money in schooling, they would say, smaller classes is not such an efficient measure, actually. There are much more efficient things to do if you want to put more money into schools. More librarians would be more efficient, more people engaged in special pedagogy. And then the general public says, oh, okay, we hear what you say, but we still want smaller classes. And as a politician, it's the people who decide. That's sort of the idea of democracy. On the other hand, smaller classes is horribly expensive, so it's not always done either way. But the point is that people can understand science, but still not agree. Yes, science can have different. This is also an interesting article. It deals with uncertainty, and of course, uncertainty is not just a thing in crisis. It's a thing in every decision making, I think. But the point is that there's a tendency to the policymakers to want to be guided for people who are more knowledgeable than they are, and the way of doing this might, in a better way, to look at institutional robustness. Of course, expertise can also have an agenda, and I just put up the picture of an old colleague of mine, Per Lundin, who wrote about city planning in the 1950s and 60s, and he points out that the city planning expertise really loved cars, and they really had an agenda in city planning, and one mustn't be naive that expertise can have an agenda, and I think policymakers are often very naive to that. First of all, researchers don't always agree, and researchers can have an agenda that can be, political or non-political. It can just be, we like cars. That's also an agenda. And it's always nice to cite Thomas Guerin, the great father of sociology of science, that, of course, a basis of scientific legitimacy is the concept of objectivity and neutrality. And how can we be objective, but still it is important to be able to advocate, I think. How do we do science to policy in Sweden? Well, we do it in several different ways. I think that possibly the best way, or the classical way of doing science to policy, is our investigative system, our committees of inquiry, where, but if you ask any retired policy researcher, they would say, okay, but it was much better 50 years ago, and it was much better 50 years ago, because I think that more researchers were involved in committees of inquiry, and committees of inquiry tend to be shorter nowadays, and my personal opinion is that unfortunately there are less and less involvement of researchers in the committee system. There's a standing committee under the Ministry of Education. You've been in that, right? Forsknings, yes, very good. There's a society in the parliament. Swedish universities and some very prominent research institutes are also agencies formally. That is unusual in an international perspective. And I think that whereas safeguarding academic freedom is, of course, a groundstone for everything we do, I think that policymakers sometimes are a little bit careful in approaching the universities as the agencies they are. There are also agencies with specific tasks of compiling knowledge. And this little weird circle down here, I was just reminded there was an interesting debate in Crises, the journal of VR, a few years ago, between Jonas Björk and Sven Stavström, old director general of VR, where Sven pointed that we should have a sort of a system of science for policy in Sweden, and Jonas claimed that we already do that by the agencies giving policy advice, and both of them had very interesting points, I think. The agencies is a way of science to policy, but that doesn't mean we don't need another system of that. And I think that would be my personal dream committee of inquiry, to put in place a system of science to policy in Sweden. I take part in, I just said that this is very starting up research. I take part in this VR-funded project, Boundaries of Legitimation, that is coordinated by Mitt Sweden University. that looks on legitimization and expertise. And now you're thinking, so that will be sort of an actor-based research, and a little bit it is, of course. And as an old historian of technology, we always hated, retired engineers writing history of technology, and we always said that, we do that much better. And we don't want retired politicians to write the history of politics either. But I think there's still a point of trying to put experiences in an academic context. But we'll see how I manage with this. I will publish something, and you can have it on peer review, of course. So does she have any conclusions? Well, a few points, I think, that I would point at in the relationship of civil defense, crisis management, and the role of scientific expertise. I think that expectations is an important part. Well, I've been coming back to that several times. Expectations, ideas of the future, and prognosis tend to be very steering. But it's also both as a policymaker and a scientist, you can't refer from making prognosis or listening to prognosis. It's certainly important, and it's also when you get that's probably what happened to in UK. If you get a prognosis in that says that, okay, like half your population is going to die if you don't do something, you have to act on it. But it's also important not to take prognosis as blueprints for future development. And you must also plan for an unlikely turn of events. What is civil defense? But I think an important part is that civil defense is much more than we think. It tends to be a lot of highlight, as it should be, of course, of weaponry and building shelters, etc. Important things, but a well-functioning healthcare system is also part of civil defense. And for example, for Swedes to be able to stay at home when we're sick, to have paid sick leave, turned out to be one of our most important measures against COVID, which probably was part of the problem in the United States, for example. So economic programs for social insurance in public health, that is also a part of civil society. And the knowledge is a part of civil defense. Universities are also important in building a civil defense. Creativity must be part of public administration, and yes, creativity is not the main trait of bureaucracy. But I think a start is to actually at least point it out. I had the idea when I entered into office that I would leave a more creative Ministry of Health. I'm not sure I did that. Or probably I didn't. But it needs to establish creativity and speed, and to be creative, bureaucracy and public administration need to have a culture of trust. And of course, there's a great body of literature in why public administration tends to be scared organization with low level of internal security. But if we want to be innovative, we also have to have acceptance. Yes, and science and policy. The relationship between science and politics needs to be better, closer, and more transparent. Yeah. And I think one part of this, is to understand that the goal of science is the same goal as politics. I mean, the goal to do research, that is to create new knowledge. And sometimes I think that is the problem, actually, when politicians believe that science is there to give advice. That's not our aim. Our aim is to produce knowledge. I just wanted, this is a classic within pandemic literature. Every epidemic is a reflection of society. Its extent is determined by our patterns and our preparedness. There's no biological imperative on how a virus will hit. It plays out in a social context. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm sure there's going to be many questions. We have an audience here and an audience online, and we will record the first half hour of this question period. And if you're online and want to ask questions, you should write in the chat. And since we have a mix of research from different fields, please also write your area of study so we can take questions from different disciplines. We also take follow-up questions, and that you can just put a finger here rather than a hand, or you write follow-up in the chat and then to whom you're following up. And I will call upon when it's your turn. So let's see, put up your hands if you want to ask a question. I don't see any hands. I'm very surprised. From Joe. course, but there was this gentleman who also wanted to ask a question. But I'll start with Joe here.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I want to ask you a little bit about kind of the management of uncertainty. There's a lot of writing in the science for policy literature about how politicians can't understand scientific uncertainty, and what they need is clear guidance, simple messages, and that's often felt by scientists who end up advising politicians to be a kind of overwhelming pressure to kind of simplify and condense. But as you pointed out, there was huge uncertainty and people disagreed. Like, these models had such widely varying predictions that it seemed really difficult from the outside to know what to do. So could you say a bit more about that? Like, do you think politicians and agency decision makers are kind of empowered? Can they make decisions in the face of scientific uncertainty? And how did you sort of see that playing out?
Thank you. Super interesting question. I think I've often been provoked by the paternalism in medical science, and I dare to say that here, not at Karolinska Institute. But there's a tendency not to believe that patients or politicians or anyone can understand uncertainty. I actually had a vivid argument with the Director General of the Public Health Agency when I pointed out, you know, what they said about oral contraceptives back in the day was that it's good that girls use oral contraceptives, because even though there's a small risk of clotting, because there's much more risks of anything if they get pregnant. Well, you know, women and girls can take responsibility for their fertility and their sexuality without you know, not speaking about the side effects of oral contraceptives. And that is such a paternalistic part of medical communication. And I think there was a few strands of that during COVID as well. I mean, the fear of speaking about uncertainty. And to me, it's really a credo to be able to do that. And I think that COVID proved that the general public understands uncertainty. It was possible to say, well, this is what we know now. Tomorrow, you know, the body of knowledge might look differently, and then measures can be differently. And measures were changed when we learned more and more about the virus, and I think there was great public acceptance for that. So I think sort of COVID can also be described as sort of a triumph for general understanding of scientific methods and how science, you know, that's the difference between science and dogmatism, is that science change. And I think really people can understand that, and policymakers as well. But I think that there's also a need sometimes to explain better which science advice one is giving. I mean, there's a difference between an educated guess or sort of something that is completely based on science. And I think that, I mean, nowadays, of course, there's general acceptance of the idea of climate change, but I think that was one of the problems in the beginning. Climate change is not an educated guess. We know that climate change is happening and that humans are causing it. But sometimes, actually, science advice is an educated guess, and that can be very valuable, but that is something else.
Can I ask you just something a little bit about examples? So I'm thinking a bit about masks. And so in the US, they did something kind of similar to here. It's just it went much faster. So at first they said, don't use masks. There isn't good scientific advice behind them. But they said it really determinately. They were like, masks don't work, don't use them. And then 3 months later, they changed their mind. And they said, oh, actually, new evidence, masks work, please use them. And a lot of people just didn't use them. Now, as you say, it got politicized. But part of what happened in that politicization was right-wing people said, well, hang on, the first message was no. Now you're saying yes. Seems very suspicious. We're not going to do it. And I think there was an extent to which in the brief window when we had a mask recommendation here, people also thought, well, come on. I mean, you just spent months telling us, don't bother. And now he's saying we must do it. Like, how do... Years, right. So I guess that's maybe a question of like messaging what the science advice was. Is that kind of how you would read it? Like, actually, it was uncertain. The initial recommendation or lack of recommendation was because there was no evidence. Now there is evidence. I think it can be quite difficult to get people to follow that journey. So how do you kind of communicate that you have a recommendation or a lack of recommendation on uncertain science, and then when it shifts, how do you kind of bring people with you? That seems really challenging.
I think the mask issue is such an interesting part of the relationship between science and policy. And sometimes I hear it being described as in Sweden that public health agency didn't recommend masks because it was not 100% evidence that it was effective. And that is not my understanding of the public health agency. My understanding is that they did not think it was an effective method. And their point of view was also, I mean, they should obviously speak for themselves, and I think there might even be someone here from public health agency. But then they thought that keeping a distance is much more important. And then to me, it's really interesting because that was also one of the discussions I wrote in the book, that I spent a lot of nights on the phone with the Director General of the Public Health Agency. But isn't that also paternalistic to say that if people wear masks, they don't understand that they have to keep a distance? Can't people do both? Or does wearing a mask that give a signal that it's okay to go to work if you're sick? No, I mean, people can understand both. So I'm reflecting in the book if there was a degree of paternalism in that, and I don't give a clear answer. I mean, obviously the Public Health Agency must answer to that. But I think it was, since the issue was so politicized, that the media debate tended to be that the Public Health Agency hates masks. And they never did. If you look at, for example, what they sent in during the summer of 2020, they pointed at masks as one of the measures to be taken in the fall. But since there was so much controversy about masks in the beginning, it sort of was the communication tended to be that understand other things, that masks are horrible and like will make you die. And then when they and the sort of the philosophy of the Public Health Agency was that keep a distance and stay at home unless you really have to. And what do you really have to do? Well, sometimes you have to go to work, right, or to daycare or something. And then you could have masks were recommended in public transport and during a period of time indoor meetings. And sometimes you have to do that. And then at a certain level of contagion, that would be realistic. But then I think the problem of adhering to that, it was very low. I mean, everyone in public transport did not wear a mask. And one of the reasons for that was probably that there had been this Public Health Agency hates masks debate, which I think was overstated. But that also shows, I think, how difficult it is to, if I can contradict myself on the idea that people understand uncertainty, that the sort of the nuances in the communication of the Public Health Agency on masks were really lost in the public debate during the first half of 2020. And I think that was also a lesson to the Public Health Agency that we need to express this more carefully.
Quickly follow up on that, because I think it was part of Joe's question. So the mask mandate came pretty late in the process, very late, as the end game, where we should use masks in the public transportation. I mean, isn't as Joe said, I mean, the problem was that it came suddenly at the end, we are supposed to wear masks, and there was no kind of perhaps convincing, oh, now suddenly we know. We should use masks.
Your question is, did science change before the mask mandate was put in place?
Yeah, very late in the process.
Yeah, but I would say that the mask mandate happened because people were not adhering to the recommendations. If you look at movement, for example, during April 2020, no one was in public transport. I know I was like the only person at work in April 2020. It was completely empty. The restaurants were closed. The Drottninggatan was completely empty. But then in the fall of 2020, we saw people getting tired of recommendations, and we saw contagion going up. So that was also a cause for other recommendations, that the people changed their behavior.
I'm aware about that, but how did you communicate that? Did you go and say, look, this is because you're not adhering anymore, so now you have to use masks?
Okay, Dad says you're misbehaving, so now there's a new lesson for you.
I didn't hear that message.
Yeah, no, maybe I don't know. Would that have been a good message? I don't know. It's really interesting. Yeah.
Okay. So the gentleman here.
Yeah, I was going to debate the ICU thing, but I think it's better to speak about the main subject here, the relationship between science and politics. And the first thing I would comment on is that, in my opinion, it is always up to political decision in the end, and that's because that, in my opinion, in the ideal case, what science can bring is the best possible prediction of outcome based on what you do. If you do masks, we think this will happen. If you don't, we believe that this will happen. If we do not do maximal efforts here, what will happen with people in elderly homes? We can try to make predictions about that, but in the end, it's a moral question. what do we do? I mean, the science can never answer that question, which way we are to take. It's a matter of judgment. How big a risk can I take in this direction? I mean, how many dead could I get? Okay, if I go the other direction and do maximal things like closing schools, how do I feel about those results? So in the end, it's always about a judgment call. Then I have to try and pose a question too. So, and that is during that first spring. That's when, in my opinion, we definitely differed a lot from other countries. During the late autumn, we did not. But what I had a big problem with Folkhälsomyndighetens communication was that they suggested that they were the world authority on all kinds of smittskydd. I can't find the word, English word. And questions in epidemiology. And that everything they said with, at least publicly, with great authority. We know that the only thing that we can do is wash our hands, was an early message. And we know that this will not leave China, for example, was also their message in January, that this will never come to Sweden at all, or Europe. And if it comes to Sweden, we will be able to suppress it because we are so good at suppressing infectious diseases that we can even do it with Messlingen, which is morbili, which is a very much more contagious thing. Well, my point is, they doing that, they did not invite debate. They were very clear on that this is the scientific way. And my question is, was because that was the external communication. How was their communication during January, February, early March with you and the political side? Was it as hardcore?
Well, thank you so much. That's many things to comment in one. Well, first of all, I completely agree with you that decisions in a democracy must be put in a democratic context, and in a context where responsibility can be demanded, and that is why some decisions are political. On the other hand, it's interesting how there are, I mean, as I point out with interest rate, there are democratic decisions sometimes to delegate responsibility, as we've done in the contagious matter law from 2001, that was decided unanimously by the parliament to delegate much of the responsibility of contagious matters to the public health agency. And I think that's an interesting, that's why I pointed out a little bit that we do this sometimes and sometimes we do not. So I mean that was the legal construction being done, and the other part is I mean there are some questions that are I write a little bit, for example, on classifying a disease as a public health hazard. Thank you. That's a very interesting discussion because it has very far-going implications of democracy. For example, you can shut down an entire area if contagion is classified as a public health hazard. So that decision is important to take only from a hemställan, I don't know the word, by an agency of expertise, because that is a dangerous tool in the hands of politicians. You can imagine that during the election day, a sort of a government of any color could want to shut down an entire part of the city, not to make these citizens vote. I mean, this is, you can actually, is one of the most far-reaching laws to be able to limit people's freedom. And it's a very interesting question. Why? I mean, it's of course a question that I pose to myself and that everyone poses. How can scientists' interpretation of data be so different in different countries? And I think that's a little bit what I'm pointing at. For example, in Denmark, if you ask the Public Health Institute, I think they would say that some of the decisions, I mean, they agreed with the Swedish Public Health Agency, but they were done on a political level. And in Sweden, we had more decisions on the agency level for a number of reasons, because of our legislation and because of our constitutional system. So sometimes the expertise were not that different, the political system. Sometimes expertise did interpret data differently. I think you're pointing at that the Public Health Agency had sort of a risk classification, the risk of general contagion, that changed very quickly. First they said, okay, there's no risk for general contagion in society, and then it changed very quickly. And I write the book that I was surprised when they raised this to the high level, and they said, so now there's no point of testing. And actually I got to know that on the press conference, and I that was not maybe my best moment for the Public Health Agency. They could have called me 5 minutes before. Anyway, but I would say that they I think that they did communicate uncertainty with the government. I think that I was a very unnerving state secretary, calling a lot, posing a lot of questions. I also write the book that I always had this idea that I have to have a horizon scanning for myself, which is, of course, was pretty difficult when you work 20 hours a day. So I was trying to, like, 5 minutes on Lancet before I went to bed, and like, okay, what's happening in research? And like, oh, there are so many articles I didn't have time to read. To be able to pose better questions. I think, for example, I reflect on the fact that maybe the Public Health Agency could have been a board agency and styrelsemyndighet. I think that could have been one way of sort of multiplying sort of the voices. In general, I think they did a fantastic job, obviously. I did not sack the Director General. But I think that the communication, I mean, your question was the communication with us more nuanced than with the general public? Personally, I don't know if I share your interpretation of the communication of the general public, obviously, because I didn't take part of it as much, and sometimes that I got to do something on press conferences as well. But yes, I would say that.
More nuanced in with you than with the public. Was that your conclusion?
Possibly, yeah. We did discuss, different scenarios, and this can take different roads, etc.
Okay. I have a disclaimer also. I just have a very short.
Again, if you want. Because you have to give other people opportunity to ask questions. That's how it works here. So now, Nanda, online.
Oh, hello. Hi, thanks so much for this talk. It's very nice also to really hear the relational, like behind the scenes aspects. I wanted to respond to what you said about how models are highly steering political thinking. And I was just wondering, because I model and particularly use social simulation, which really goes to the behavioral aspects of, how do humans respond to these situations? And as a community, we immediately saw that epidemical models were not including like behavioral theories or empirical insights. So we were already worried very early on, but we felt a bit like, how do we engage? And so I was just curious how you navigate, like, which models to select, or who do you work with, and how do you get trust in a model from your perspective?
Thank you. I think that's it's very interesting with modeling and who's doing the model and whose model are being publicly communicated. But also, I mean, we do have a system in Sweden with very small ministries. I mean, I had no single mathematicians or medical doctor, or even, I think I had one nurse, but she was working on something else, employed in the ministry. So there's no chance for a ministry to have a relationship on their own with, or do their own models, etc. So, and that is sort of how we built our government system. So the government is very dependent on the agencies. So the short answer is that we had to trust that the agencies had a horizon scanning and modeling. And I also hear, I have colleagues in Umeå who also describes this, that we had done better models, and models that took into more account alternative behaviors, for example, than sort of the mainstream models. And I think there was a lot of scientific development of models during the time. And the interesting thing that how can we sort of develop science in the midst of a crisis when the communication channels are also so cluttered? I mean, there's just a number of epidemiologists in Sweden. The agency, they grew in a number of people, but not enough. And we were also a small ministry. So I think, and we're also trying to point at that just the capacity of a ministry or an agency is also a risk during a crisis. There's a risk that rising scanning is not being done, that people don't have the time to read the Lancet, and that has to be taken into account during any crisis. And I think that Emma describes in her chapter how she tried to put these insights into account when Russia invaded Ukraine, to really quickly put extra resources to the relevant ministers. And I think that human capital is always actually one of the risks during a crisis.
Yeah, thanks. I guess it's also to build these bonds before a crisis, as you already indicated, is crucial.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Very good. Then we have the next question also from online. Peter, no? Disappeared. Oh, there.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. Thanks for a super talk. My question is related or similar to Nanda's. Technology solutions were proposed. Apple and Android developed stuff that was used around the world. My question is, who would you trust? What agency would you go to look at tools that would fall in between the domains of different experts? Because I think we never considered this solution, and maybe was it because you couldn't point to someone to tell you that's a good thing. Some countries had success, others had failures, but it's a tool in the toolbox that was never considered in Sweden, according to me. Can you comment on that? Thank you.
Well, if you're speaking of, for example, tracking apps, it was considered in Sweden, and there was it's a well-published dialogue between MSB and the Public Health Agency, thanks to our publicity principle. All their emails that can be found online in the discussion of this app. So this was discussed to and fro between MSB, the civil something agency, and the Public Health Agency, and with the regions, if this was a good idea or not, and different aspects were made. And I know that if you tech companies were in this process too, but in the end, the agencies decided not to have an app. And I think that is also an example where it would have been remarkable to have a political decision. If the agencies agreed that this is not a good idea, I think it would have been a little bit remarkable to step in. And it's, I mean, this has been a fantastically interesting process. There's actually a chapter in my other book that will be presented in September, a little bit on COVID tracking and how this worked differently in democracies and non-democracies, so to say, because of course data about people's movement can be used in different ways. We did use data from, for example, Telia and Google on movement, and I think that is not a self-evident data to use either, but we did because it was the best data we had available, and that came from MSB as well.
Good. Thanks for that. And then we have Valdemar, I think.
Thank you. Valdemar Ingdahl here at the Institute of Futures Studies. I have a question regarding institutional memory and previous experiences. It's, after all, not the first time. We had the avian flu, we had the swine flu with its own debate and discussion. And in your experience in a crisis situation, is there an historical precedent where you start to think, what would you do last time, and maybe that didn't work out then? Or is it easy to get caught up in the middle of the crisis?
I think that for January 2020, I asked my coworkers, so can you just drop the memo on the swine flu on my desk and I can look it through, like, conclusions and experiences. And they were like, the memo on the swine flu? I was like, the memo on the swine flu, it wasn't that long ago since we had an epidemic. And they were like, oh, actually, there's no memo. I was like, what? They were like, maybe you can speak to this Martin guy. He was around then. I was like, oh, I have a memo. There are a few reports on the swine flu, but I was personally surprised that there was so little published. I mean, we just had this gigantic flu that, didn't really turn into the pandemic we thought it would, but there was a lot of lessons learned. And I also had another, I think, interesting thing is that the pandemic plan, sort of the general plan for pandemic, that was presented in December 1919. So I had it on my desk when COVID hit. And part of it was super relevant. It was really newly updated, but part of it was written for influenza. And you know, COVID was a virus, but it was not influenza. It did you know, act in other ways. So it's interesting how you can be prepared and not prepared, I think. And I mean, COVID was not a black swan. I mean, we knew that a pandemic would happen. I mean, there should obviously have been better planning for a pandemic. It's unbelievable that we had, you know, stockpiling for 1.5 days or something for materials and disinfection, etc. How could that happen? We also had a crisis. I don't know if you remember this. We had sort of a crisis during the fall of 1919 when a video company won the procurement of healthcare material in personal protective equipment in Uppsala, and obviously this video company. I'm a little bit. I'm saying it a little bit ironically, but then they were out of plastic gloves, and then operations could be done in Uppsala. That's also like, how can this not work? And we put so much trust in these global chains, and then they break down. But this was one of the reasons I tried to describe that. You know, it was the midst of a storm and things were difficult to think about. But it's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. And that's one of the reasons why we put the Corona Commission in place, because it was important to have a public evaluation. We did try to give other, I remember it's also mentioned in the book, I gave a government assignment to IVO, the inspection of healthcare. Can you just think a little bit of what we can learn? They were like, this is a great government assignment. It's rather vague, but can you just, you know, keep a notepad and write up things that we have to remember until next time? But there's not enough institutional learning, and there's not enough institutional collection of experiences. I really agree with you.
I would just like to follow up on that, because I wonder, I mean, there was a plan from the Public Health Authority before the pandemic. There was also a plan from the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control. They were rather similar, I think. And they were based on the earlier pandemic. Mm. So in that sense, there was an institutional memory.
Well, that's true, yeah. I mean, there was that preparedness, but yeah.
Sweden followed the plan a bit more than other countries did.
Yeah, one can say that in some of the aspects that were more politicized later on. On the other hand, I think, I mean, some of the parts were, for example, in the pandemic plan, it was so the regions are responsible for stockpiling this and that, and like obviously they had no incentive to do that. And I mean, the public health agencies would obviously know that the regions, you know, they were like.
That's about the plan not being implemented.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's true.
So, okay, but I mean that you must have directly gotten on your board. You know?
Yeah, definitely. It was there, and it's like, okay, let's see what to do. Like, oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah. There you go. Okay, so there's still time for questions. We're going to go for a second round. If no one, we prioritize people who haven't asked questions, but we go for a second round now. People who already asked questions, so we start over again with Joe.
So I wanted to come back to the, you know, you met with these researchers, and then it was reported as you were meeting with the opponents or the critics or whatever. I guess the question I have is, it does seem like it's important for you to be able to talk to other experts. So I was interested when you said, you know, the ministries are quite small, you don't have internal modeling capacities, but it is also your job to fire them if they're doing a bad job in the agency. So, but how do you know if they're doing a bad job if you don't go and talk to other experts? I mean, a lot of their job, okay, their job in part is making decisions, which, as we discussed, is complicated and is not just about what the science says, but they do have to get the science right. So it seems like it's kind of important for you to be talking to some other experts, or to have some mechanism for knowing whether they're getting that kind of technical scientific part of their job wrong. So how do you do that? Because of course you have to trust them in some sense, but you also have to evaluate them in another sense.
I guess that's also part when you're, sorry, do you want to add something?
I want to add that. How did you identify experts?
Yeah, that's definitely, and I think I'm self-critical in the book on how I did the seminars, because I just called Göran on Vetenskapsakademin and was like, oh, I got to speak to someone. He was like, I'm going to put together a few seminars. And like, why did I call Göran? I could have called maybe Vetenskapsrådet or something. That would have made more sense. I could have called Gustav Arrhenius. Always call Gustav Arrhenius when you have a problem, obviously. But the thing is that it was a little bit haphazard. And I you know, I write that self-critically, that how could it be that in the midst of the pandemic, I was like, who am I going to call? And that is such a, you know, it's a, it's a sign of a dysfunctional system if you're calling your friend Göran when you want to know something about epidemiology. But the evaluation, I think one has to be able to trust the public debate, and I think that was the part that I wished would have been better during COVID. I mean, we would have wished to have more researchers. They could be pro or against, or pro another disease. I don't know, but to have more researchers present in the public debate. And there's of course there's a system of responsibility in the parliamentary system. Of course, the other parties could have taken initiatives to get rid of the minister or the director general or do something. They didn't do that. I think on one occasion the Sweden Democrats wanted to sack not the director general, who is possible to sack, but the state epidemiologist, who is not possible to sack. But okay, nevertheless. So that is sort of the system there is. But I agree with you. That is of course in some fields, there's also an inspection. I mean, there's the inspection of social insurances and the inspection of healthcare. There's no inspection of public health. And I'm not completely sure how that would be done, but I think that's a little bit what I'm getting at when I write that maybe there should have been a board in the Public Health Agency. Maybe there should have been a little bit of plurality. The Public Health Agency installed a scientific council during the pandemic. And I also write that I think I should have put that in a government assignment instead of letting them do it itself. It would have been clearer. On the other hand, everything happened at once and we didn't have time to write that. But that would have been a clearer line of decisions.
Any more questions? Otherwise, we have to end on that rather depressing note.
Oh, sorry, we should have ended something else.
And thank you so much for this very interesting and hot topic, still hot topic. We have seminars coming up September 11th next week. We're going to talk about by Gary Cullity from Australia on how discriminatory attitudes can make actions wrong. And then we have September 18th, we have Lucas Meyer from Graz, University of Graz. He's probably going to talk about something about climate change, but I don't know exactly what. And then we have September 25th, we have Michael Grätz, who is not from Graz, but his name is Grätz, from the Swedish Institute for Social Research, and a title to be announced. No, he's going to talk about measuring equality of opportunity, a very fantastic topic. You're very welcome, all of you then. Thank you.